Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday class. The number one question I received from last week's lesson, the first lesson in Judges, was why did I choose Judges to teach about? Why did I choose that at this time? Well, honestly, it had nothing to do with the times of today. It had to do with the idea that Judges is one of those books that we hear some of the stories out of, but not all. We also get pieces of stories, but not the whole story. And so I wanted to be able to express a book to you, to teach a book to you, to give you maybe some inspiration, maybe some understanding, and from some stories that you may not have heard from the Bible. I will admit that the book of Judges is, well, it does end in a bad way. We need to understand that this is a book that doesn't have a happy ending. And most of the stories in Judges is, again, not with a happy ending. Most of them do not end happily. But the book of Judges is teaching a very particular thing. The book of Judges is trying to teach the Hebrew people their history, in a sense. Now, and I know that some of you out there, and we've talked about this in the class, don't view this as real history. It's more theological history, and I agree with you in that. Is that in a lot of ways this is the book of Judges, or the book of Joshua, or the book of Judges is again a book about failure. Over and over and over again, there's failure in what they do, and as you move through the book of Judges, you also see that it begins with good. It begins with a great story. It begins with a story about a man who follows God, who listens to God, and then it slowly evolves to where God is less and less and less being listened to, if not listened to at all. And so as we progress, we will see what happens to culture and society when they do not pay attention to their God, when they don't pay attention to what God asks of them. At the same time I say that, we need to remember that this is the covenant people. They had a very special relationship with God, and they were supposed to live into that relationship. They had a covenant relationship with God. We as Christians have a covenant relationship with God also. But the Judges during the time of the Judges, the covenant relationship was a much different type of covenant relationship than what we have with our God today, with God today. So those were that was the main reason why I think I wanted, or one part of the reasoning of why I wanted to teach you from the book of Judges. Okay, so to get back into it, I want to kind of recap a little bit. Is that last week's was, I gave you a little bit of introduction into the time and the period and so forth, and what led up to this, which was the conquest by Joshua. How Joshua had led them into the territory, and then had conquered enough of it that they had a bridgehead, and the people, the tribes themselves, could then start building their community, building their own territory, conquering and taking the people out, and as they were supposed to do. And as we saw last week, it also starts at the bottom of the map. It starts down in Judah. And then slowly moves forward, upward, north to Benjamin, and then into the tribes of Joseph, which was, as I pointed out, if you watched the video last week, I said the wrong names, but I flashed them up on the screen that I had brain gas. But it's went through Benjamin, and then the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, which were the sons of Joseph. And then through Zebulun, and all the way up to the top of the map where Dan was supposed to be. If you look at the map and you find out where the tribes actually were at the end of the Judges period, at the time of David, or when Saul started the consolidation, you'll see that Dan was not at the top of the map. The town of Dan is at the top of the map, but the tribe of Dan is not at the top of the map. In fact, they're buried down inside, below Zebulun and Ephraim and Manasseh. Dan wasn't able to accomplish its mission. So, well, I didn't go into that last week, but that's kind of why Dan is not where it's supposed to be. If you remember from last week, they weren't able to take the high country, the hill country. Well, that was the northern end of their territory, and they never were able to take it. And so they actually got land allotted to them from from a couple of the other tribes. But that's much later. So that's kind of where we are, is that the tribes are supposed to start taking their territory. Last week also, the first chapter 1 and the first 5 verses of chapter 2 were a prologue. What we're looking at today is chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 6. So it's chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 6. So if you want to read ahead, you want to pause here and read it ahead, or if you just want to follow along with me. I'm using the New Revised Standard Version, and so that's the translation that I am using. If you want to follow along that, or use whatever translation you're comfortable with. That's the way it works in the class. Some bring a Living Bible, some others brings a Jerusalem Bible. We have all kinds of different types or translation of Scripture in the class. And so bring your favorite Bible, the one that you study with the most often, and follow along with me. Today, chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 6, a lot like last week's, the first lesson, is another prologue. We haven't got to the first judge yet. All we've gotten to is kind of an overall history. Last week, the prologue was kind of a historical. Here is the world as it is. This is a real world kind of description. And again, it's a snapshot of the whole book of Judges, compressed down into that chapter and 6 verses. But it describes how they physically were not able to do what God had tasked them to do. How they failed along the way. That was the physical part. And that's what that first prologue. Now, the second prologue, the part we're going to read today, Judges chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 6, is a second prologue. And this leads into, but this is a spiritual prologue. This is how is their relationship to God working. Not how is their relationship with their neighbors, how are they doing in conquering their territory in the physical world, but how is their relationship with God? What is their spiritual relationship? And that's what today's lesson is going to be. And again, it's an encapsulation of the entire period of the Judges before we get to that very first story. But it is, again, a theological view. It is a view of their relationship with God, more so than their view of their relationship with the land that they're supposed to conquer. So, beginning with Judges chapter 2, verse 6. When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites all went to their own inheritance to take possession of the land. The people worshipped the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. So they buried him with the bounds of his inheritance in Timnah-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Moreover, the whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Okay, so this is the first paragraph, this is the first piece, and this is the death of Joshua. And again, we had the death of Joshua in the first chapter, and again, that was to lay up the physical world. This is the death of Joshua in the days of and those of the elders that outlived Joshua. That would have been Caleb and a handful, maybe just a handful of others who may have made it all the way from captivity to the promise. But all of those people that just died in this scene, in this section of the story, all of those, the elders that had died, those that were with Joshua and Caleb as they crossed through the wilderness, those that came out the other side, as those people died, those were the last of the people who had seen what God could do. They had heard what God could do, but they had never seen what God could do. They didn't see the parting of the Sea of Reeds. They didn't see the fire and the smoke. They didn't live through the plagues. They didn't live through the relationship with the manna. They didn't have any of that. This generation grew up without having any of that first-hand knowledge of God's wonder work in the world. And so when Joshua died at 110, and then those elders that were of his generation, they all eventually died, and no one in Israel, no one in the whole land had ever seen what God's mighty works were. We see that as Joshua dies, that we're reminded that he was from the tribe of Ephraim, and originally that was the first tribe. That was the eldest, or that was the son. That was one of the sons of Joseph, and that was the Joshua had been selected as the lead, as the war chief, and had led them into the promise. And now he, Ephraim, the son of Ephraim, Joshua, the son of Nun, who was the son of Ephraim. Again, when we talk of son of, we're talking generations sometimes. I am the son of John Henry, but that would have been 3 generations ago. So that's the kind of thing in this kind of language that I speak. He is a son of Joseph. He is a son of Ephraim. Was Joshua. So Joshua dies at 110, and they tell us in the story that he is buried in the territory of Ephraim, and he's buried north of a particular mountain, the mountain Mount Gaash. So that old generation is gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grows up after them who had never witnessed what kinds of work that God would do and could do in the world. This is Joshua chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshipped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshipped Baal and Astartes. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress. So, what happens is, and this is, you need to hear this line again. This is the very first line of verse 11. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That is kind of the opening phrase as we move forward through Judges. You will see that opening phrase. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And all that tells you is the next thing that's going to happen is God's going to step into the picture in some way or another. So again, remember, this is a theological relationship history with God. This is how are the people dealing with their relationship with God. And what happens is, again, the story tells us, and they worship the Baals. It's interesting is that Baal which is Baal, depends on how you want to pronounce it, But Baal is according to the myth of that region of the world at the time, Baal was the son of Dagon. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. Which was Dagon. I'm sorry, Dagon. And Dagon was the god, the chief god of the Philistines. And Baal was his son. And so the Canaanites had this god that would have been introduced to them. And so it wasn't even their own, a god of their own creation. This was also a god that was told to them as the Canaanites lived there, this was the god of this area. We have to recognize too that part of the belief system in that region, in that part of the world at this time in the world, the time of the judges, was that the god of this valley here was the god of this valley, and there was another god who was the god of that mountain over there, or the god of that hill. But this valley had its own god, its own version of Baal, and that's why you see in this it says Baals with a plural. It's a pluralized because there were forms of Baal, and each different definition of Baal lived in a particular valley, or on a particular hill, or in this particular village, or you get the picture. So that's why that's a pluralized thing. Well, what the story is telling us is that the Israelites stopped following and listening to Yahweh, to Adonai. Instead, they started listening to Baal, to the different Baals, depending on the territory. Remember, each tribe had its own territory, so each tribe would have been dealing with a different Baal. Well, they started listening to the Baals instead, and they abandoned that, and they also started to start worshiping also the Astartes. Now, Baal was the god of thunder, the thunder on the mountain kind of god, and Astartes was I'm trying to remember. I'm going to say that Astartes is a fertility god, a goddess. Let's put it that way, a goddess, a female god, and Astartes is another version, another variety of Ashtoreth, and so they're the same. They're the same, and Ashtoreth comes in much later, but again, Astartes in our story here is pluralized. Again, there are multiple types of Astartes, of fertility goddesses in this region. And so, as the people, as the Israelites start falling away and failing to listen to God and start listening to the Baals and the Astartes, then God, of course, gets angry about that. And they abandoned Yahweh, they abandoned Adonai, and so Adonai abandons them. They abandoned the Lord and worshiped Baal and the Astartes, so the anger of the Lord, this is verse 14 again, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. So God's response, Adonai's response to Israel's failure to follow, is that he allows the Canaanites, who they're supposed to be able to conquer, to beat them up, to continue to come in and plunder them, and take some of them and sell them off into power, into their enemies. When he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies, it means that he just gave them over to them. He allowed them to overpower the Israelite people, so they couldn't beat them back. And whenever the Israelites, whatever tribe marched out to go out and push the Canaanites out because they're being attacked or whatever, Adonai would bring them instead to misfortune. He would make it so that they wouldn't win, that they wouldn't defeat whatever enemy was coming at them. And this is just as Adonai had warned them, just as Yahweh had warned them way back in the Old Testament, back in the previous stories, back in Numbers and in Leviticus. where God, or in Exodus, where God is laying out the covenant relationship and how they are to be, that if they abandon God, God would abandon them. And so whenever this happened, they were in a great distress because God had abandoned them. Well, now let's move on. Let's find out what is the further response in this. Picking up now with Judges chapter 2, verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people transgressed my covenant that I commanded their ancestors, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. In order to test Israel, whether or not they would take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their ancestors did, the Lord had left those nations, not driving them out at once, and had not handed them over to Joshua. So, God's response, every time that there's groaning, every time there's this kind of turmoil, the enemies, the Canaanites are oppressing them again, and they start groaning and complaining, or actually they start groaning about it, not complaining, but start groaning about this. And every time this happened, God would move his spirit into an individual tribal judge and create a judge in a sense. It's interesting is that of all of the this is again, the book is called Judges, but it's interesting that in all of the stories there's only one who actually does judgment, that does judging, that sits and makes judgment about the tribe, about what's going on, and actually sits in as the judge. There's only one, and that's Deborah, which is just kind of interesting. The rest of the judges are more like war chiefs than they are a judge, at least in our description. Now, they may have served in the purpose or the position of judge and actually sat at the gate and did all of that they're supposed to do, or under the tamarind tree and make judgment. They may have actually done that, but it's not described in the stories except for Deborah. So that's just kind of an interesting little side note there. So, although the Lord, so at this stage of the game, and this is a repetitive pattern, what this section is talking to us about, this little piece that we're looking at now, is the repetitive pattern we're going to see all through the rest of the book of Judges. Is that the oppression happens, the people groan, God hears the groaning, he instills himself into a war chief who he raises up, and as long as that war chief is alive, that one who listens to God and they listen to the chief, then things go their way. But as soon, what it describes here is that as soon as that judge dies, the people immediately abandon Yahweh again, they abandon Adonai again, and they turn back to the Baals and the Astartes, back to the Baals and the Ashtoreths. And so this is the repetitive pattern that we're going to see through this story, or through the rest of this book. It is interesting is that it's kind of in a pattern of a major figure and then two minor figures. And there's a major figure, and then there's two minor figures. And there's a major figure, and then two minor figures. And so that's also a pattern that we get as we move through Judges. So, God would raise up a judge from inside the tribe, and that judge would always he would deliver them out of the hands of their enemies, and for a while the people would follow Yahweh again, and then as soon as he died, they would fall back. They would backslide. And in fact, the story tells us, or this description tells us, that each generation it got worse. So that by the time we get to the Samson story, or the stories after Samson, it is absolute chaos with God. The chaos is with the people in their relationship with God. And so God then also reminds us that here is why this is all happening. It's because the people transgressed the covenant. They broke the covenant with God. He had that relationship with them is, I will be your God and you will be my people. And as long as we live in that relationship, you will prosper, you will do well, you will be able to do anything. But the people keep breaking that covenant. They keep breaking that relationship. And they don't listen to God. Or when they do hear him, they don't obey. They don't obey his voice. They don't listen, and they don't obey. And so God says, I'm just not going to drive out the enemies anymore. I left enough of the enemy there. And again, this is the testing in a way. God is just this. I did this so that I could test their endurance with the covenant. How well can they hold on to the covenant? That's why I've left these tests for them, this remnant of the Canaanites left over after Joshua, that you, people of God, you must take care of. And they fail, and they fail, and they fail, and they forget, and they drop away, and they forget. And so that's where we are then. That kind of describes to us what's going to happen next. And so the final section here, this is kind of, if I want to remind you of another thing that you may have already heard, or if you were part of my class in the past, I know you've heard this, but I want to remind you also that every time you run across a kind of a genealogy, that there is a transformation happening in the story. And this next little section, in this very strange way, is that genealogy. Only it's not a genealogy so much as it's a list of nations that are still there. And so we have this list of names. And I guess if anything else, that it's usually a genealogy, but here we have it, it's actually a list of names. So this is our last section of Judges, chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. It was only that successive generation of Israelites might know war, to teach those who had no experience of it before. The 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons. And they worshipped their gods. So, these are the nations, these are the people who God left there, and to test. Now, I know that a lot of times we look at these stories and we go, well, sometimes these stories are written after the fact, and explanations as to here is why this thing happened. And a lot of that is true. A lot of that is true. And so we need to recognize that little aspect of these stories is that, again, this story was written down before David had taken Jerusalem back from the Jebusites. So that's when this story was written down. So it was probably sometime during Saul's reign. Again, it's very possible that it was during that period of time, during the consolidation of the Israelite people under Saul. Saul was not able to accomplish it completely, but he got a pretty good chunk of it built together before David took control. And so it is very possible that at that time of consolidation under Saul, as they began the consolidation, that these stories had started being collected and were starting to be written down. And maybe that's why we get the idea that maybe Samuel had written them down, because Samuel was the prophet / judge of the day. But he was not a scribe, so I leave that to people of more historical and theological scholarliness than I have. All I know is that the story tells us that this is the reason why these people were left there, to test the Israelites and their relationship with God. And it tells us it was the 5 lords of the Philistines. That would have been those 5 major cities of the Philistines, starting with Gath, and I'm not going to name them all, but that's one of the major ones is Gath. All of the Canaanites, which is again we see here is a tribe of their own. This is the largest of them. It's interesting is how they're labeled here is that they're labeled in as we move down further. The listing of names is in how strong they were, and so we have the Philistines and the Canaanites and the Sidonians. That's Sidon. That's up north, up in Syria. And the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, and that would be where Lebanon is today. That's the lower hill country of Lebanon, of our modern day Lebanon. Mount Baal Hermon, and as far as Lebo Hamath. And that's just the kind of a territorial view of where God left these people. You can look on a map where those last 2, Mount Baal Hermon and Lebo Hamath are. You can look on a map and find them. Most Bibles that you have, I know, have maps in the back. Look for the time of the tribes, or the time of the Canaanites. But as our story tells us, then that these people were left there because to test Israel. They were there for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of Adonai, of Yahweh, of their Lord, or whether they would, and the commandments of their ancestors that had been given to them by Moses, whether they were going to follow those or not. And so it tells us then, as part of this testing, was that they were left to live among the Canaanites. And again, this is in. Now this listing is in by power. The Canaanites, the Hittites. Now again, the Canaanites is a major tribe. The Hittites were Anatolia. They were up in far, I guess it would be eastern Turkey area, and the Hittite Empire was coming into power at this time, and they had actually stretched quite far into the territory. And so the Hittites, there was a Hittite people in the territory. The Amorites, and again, just another a smaller group, but again a powerful group. The Amorites become very difficult. The Perizzites, the Hivites, both of those are killed off, along with the Jebusites. Well, that's not actually true. Even after David conquers Jebus, the Jebusite city, even after he conquers it and turns it back into Jerusalem and builds his fortress Zion on the one hill, David's fortress on the one hill. even after that, there were still Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. And so they weren't, even the Jebusites weren't completely conquered even after David's time, which is just kind of interesting. And so, what we find out too is in the final nail into this thing is that they started marrying into the Canaanites, into the people that lived there. They started getting daughters. They started taking their daughters as their wives and giving their own daughters to the sons of these foreign peoples. And they started worshiping the other gods. Now we see this quite frequently in later stories. In fact, this is the very thing that brings down Samuel. This is the very thing that brings down Samuel. Solomon. This is the very thing that brings down Solomon. Solomon takes wives of other countries. Now, again, that's not unusual for a king to take the daughters of other kings. That kind of consolidates their power. And that's kind of what Solomon had done. David did it too, but Solomon did it much more. Solomon's grave error, the thing that eventually gets him where he loses the throne, where his son his son Rehoboam takes over, and he's a failure, and the whole nation falls apart, is because Solomon chose wives from other peoples, and more dastardly, more opposed to God, is that he started worshiping their gods. He built temples and shrines to his wives' gods, and he also worshipped there with them. And that ticked God off. And that's exactly how this story ends for today. Our lesson ends today, is that they give their daughters to these foreign peoples, and they take daughters as their own from these foreign peoples, and they start intermarrying with them. And in that intermarrying, they also start following the other gods. And here ends our lesson for today. As you've noticed, I very seldom will bring a conclusion to these stories so that you have something to take away from them. You need to take away the whole story. I'm not going to tell you, here's my theological point for the day, because this isn't a sermon. This is a lesson on what this story says. And so if you're looking for a lesson from me that has an ending and some sort of philosophy or something you can take away from it, I leave that to you. And so, there ends our class today. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And all God's people said, Amen.